August 9th, he enlisted in the 122nd New York State Volunteers. He was appointed Sergeant Major in Company 1. The regiment was recruited in Onondaga County and organized in Syracuse. Many of the volunteers were farmers' sons. A man named James Gere. I get confused between the actor. Maybe one day we'll play in the movie. The majority were farmers' sons, and he was a very well-known farmer here in Syracuse, and he was responsible for getting all these farmers together. Osgood's brother Will had already been at war for 16 months. The week before, the love story, here we go again. Osgood proposed. He talked about in his letters the ring that he had made by a local jeweler. He was so excited. But Nellie answered, "Perhaps you should think of me now only as a friend." One is left to wonder why Nellie said no. There's this twist. One possibility is that 4 months prior, her 12-year-old half-brother, Frank Sedgwick, and his best friend, Tommy Barnes, who was the son, they were inseparable friends. And Tommy Barnes was the son of an abolitionist man and his wife. The Barnes owned a house right on James Street, which became the Corinthian Club, and escaped enslaves were sent through that home, and meetings were held. And these two boys sadly drowned in a pond behind the Sedgwick home. Both sets of parents were out of town, and Nellie may have been responsible for watching the boys. Perhaps still reeling from any sadness or guilt she felt, she couldn't allow herself to accept any happiness that an engagement should afford. Osgood's letters are clear through his 3-year service that they indicate his deep longing, continued longing for Nellie, and his worry and frustration over their relationship. There was a big send-off rally held in Fayetteville, New York for the 122nd. Thousands of Onondaga County residents attended in late August. This woman, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, an abolitionist, woman suffragist, and Native American advocate, spoke to the 1,000-man regiment and crowd, and she said, "Let liberty be your watchword and your war cry alike," she spoke to the regiment. "What caused this war? Slavery, and nothing else." She then presented a flag made by the women of Fayetteville to Colonel of the regiment, Silas Titus. Osgood was mustered in August 28th. They had 2 days training on the grounds that are now the fairgrounds. And then they boarded trains and left home on August 31st. En route, they stopped in New York City. Osgood wrote about the excitement it was seeing parades, and there was all this excitement and good feelings about heading off, even though it was the darkest period of the war to date. On September 3rd, from Baltimore, Maryland, he penned his first letter of, like I said, 200 home, and this one was written to his mother. The regiment arrived in Sharpsburg, Maryland, just after the fighting concluded at the Battle of Antietam. On September 17th, this battle took place, and to this day, that battle had more casualties in American history to date. Witnessing the battlefield's aftermath, Osgood wrote the next day on the 18th, "This gave us a rather realizing sense of war." And here in these two photographs, I just place them together because this is before Osgood left for war, and this is a wartime photo, and you can just see sort of the difference in his facial expressions and strength. Seen a lot. The first month, the regiment was assigned to the Army of the Potomac, the 6th Army Corps, and it was led by General John Sedgwick, who was Nellie's father's first cousin. The letters Osgood wrote provide insight into day-to-day Army life and the uncertainty men felt regarding their place as part of the larger military campaigns. They were what you would call green. You know, Osgood wrote about that they were excited, they wanted to see battle, and then they were shocked at what they were seeing, and then they didn't want to participate as much, but they but they did still. It just changed so quickly. Osgood's mother kept this scrapbook. Within it, she pasted news articles, poetry, obituaries, her family tree, the flowers that Osgood sent home. And that is the book that always interested me. There's a Confederate bill and the flowers before Petersburg, March 1865, 3 months before the war's end. His correspondence to his mother, Nellie, his brothers, extended family, and friends continued unabated throughout the war, besides 2 points: his regimental guard duty in Sandusky, Ohio, and Osgood's capture at the Battle of the Wilderness and imprisonment, which we'll get to. Osgood wrote very often about his comrade friends. Many of the officers he knew before leaving home. Some he did not, he met there. This man on the left, he did not know before. His name was Frank Worcester, and he was a lawyer from Tully, New York. He was married. He didn't have any children. He became my great-great-grandfather's best friend. He actually saved a man from being executed. He was to be executed because of desertion, and Osgood was to lead the men to, his company to watch this execution that would happen at noon. And he sent Frank, who they called Worcester, to see President Lincoln to try to get this abstained. And Frank made it back within 5 minutes of the time. But sadly, Frank was killed by a sharpshooter at the Battle of Cold Harbor. And Osgood last saw him at the Battle of the Wilderness, which was the wilderness, Virginia, is a tangly forest, and everything was on fire. And Osgood wrote about shaking Frank's hand. They came upon each other in battle, and they shook hands and clasped hands, and that was the last time he saw his friend. Brothers in war. This is Osgood with his brother Will. Will is holding an injured arm, which we'll get to in a later slide. He also had extended family, his uncle and cousins. His uncle was General Edwin Vo Sumner, who was beloved by the Sixth Corps of men. He was the oldest field commander in the war, North or South. He died at age 70, actually in service for the war. He was in Syracuse en route west to serve. His funeral was held in Syracuse at the home of his daughter, Sarah Sumner Teal, who was an early Syracuse historian and author. These were his cousins, Edwin Bowes Jr. and Samuel Sturrow Sumner, who Osgood was close to. They were about the same age, and they would write each other and see each other often, in camp and field. The grand advance. In the weeks following Antietam, the 122nd chased the enemy. The men gave the regiment the nickname the Flying Onondagas. On November 2nd, they received orders to move south. We are to cross the Potomac, Osgood wrote, at 8 tomorrow morning. This will be my first appearance on the sacred soil. I hope we shall not stop until we get to Richmond. He would have a ways to go. This is the winter of 1863. At Fredericksburg, Virginia, more than 12,000 soldiers lay dead. Winter snows arrived, and it turned the roadways to mud. Osgood, actually at that time, had a furlough, and he went to visit Nellie in Washington. Her father was serving in Congress, and she would go down and visit. And he was always trying to see her when he had the chance. And he wrote about being very lucky that he missed the marching in the mud. But they settled into their winter camps, and Osgood wrote about that, and also the broader scope of war, his concern, and always going back to this concern that Nellie would meet another suitor. In spring of 1863, Osgood was promoted to second lieutenant. This cross that he drew became the 6th Corps badge. The men had it on their jacket and on their hats. Encounters at this time with the enemy pickets were happening, and newly liberated slaves he wrote about in the destruction of the southern plantations. In June 1863, in the wake of the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee turned his army north. Osgood turned 23. He wrote, "Leaving the Rappahannock River about the middle of June, we had constant severe marching until the afternoon of July 1 found us at Manchester, Maryland, about 36 miles from Gettysburg. We left Manchester on the evening of July 1 and all through the dreary night pushed on toward Gettysburg. As morning dawned, the sound of the second day's battle greeted our ears as we hurried forward to the assistance of our comrades of the Army of the Potomac." I'll just read a little bit more from that because it's, oops, did I just close it? Skip that. Sorry, 1 minute.
Nope. Yes.
Just. Oh, thank you. Just go back to the flag. Okay. Oh, thank you, Lori. You're a savior. So Osgood wrote later about the battle and approaching the battle. "Halting only for the occasional 5 minutes rest and twice to make coffee, we struggled on through that hot July day, nerved to renewed efforts as the sound of the battle grew louder and louder. We reached the banks of Rock Creek, just in the rear of the battlefield at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and redeemed the promise our noble Sedgwick had made the night before. He said, 'Tell General Meade,' he said to the staff officers who brought the orders, 'Tell General Meade I will be at Gettysburg with my corps at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon.' Part of our corps was engaged that night, marching onto the field in a double quick after their long and arduous march, and assisted in relieving the 3rd Corps. Our brigade went into Bivouac, a little in rear of the front line of battle, sleeping on our arms. We men roused again before daylight and moved over to Culp's Hill on our extreme right. And for a short time, we were in reserve, but Lee was making a desperate attempt to turn our right, and a regiment in front of us, having got out of ammunition, we were ordered forward to take their places. We charged across the knoll and reoccupied the breastworks, which, with other regiments on our right and left, we held against their repeated charges until they abandoned their attack in despair. While behind the breastworks and in the midst of the fight, a regiment moved up and took the place of one of our immediate left, and it proved to be the 149th New York, organized in this county the next month after ours, and which belonged to the 12th Corps. And this was the only time during the war that we met as regiments. The regiment faced the enemy on the fields of Gettysburg in that extreme temperature and heat. At Culp's Hill, they repulsed a day of Confederate assaults on the line. For an hour, Osgood wrote, or two, there was a lull in the battle, and then was opened that terrific artillery fire, which was intended to sweep the crest of Cemetery Ridge of our batteries and troops preparatory to Pickett's famous charge. He would write about his close combat, the fighting 5 feet apart from one another with swords slashing, and we've all seen it, horrible, and we can't even imagine it. And after one of those close encounters fighting, he wrote that he thought about his great-grandfather Burrows, who I mentioned earlier, who had fought in the Revolutionary War. And he said he thought of him and it gave him courage to keep on. So I always feel this sort of circle of life here in Osgood's letters and thoughts. The day after the battle, on July 4th, Osgood wrote his mother twice. He, I'm sure, was trying to comfort her. You know, soldiers didn't write their mothers a lot of detail. He would sometimes write about the battles. He wrote more often to his brothers and friends about the details. But on July 4th, at 11 a.m., he said, "Dear mother, we had a hard fight yesterday. We had 7 men killed. 10 would die later, or 10 in full would die. 31 wounded, besides Major Davis, who had his jaw broken, and Lieutenant LaRue, who was wounded in the thigh. They were the only officers wounded. The two men, one on each side of me, were wounded, etc. But I providentially escaped unhurt. Our regiment behaved splendidly. We were at this time attached to the 12th and were fighting side by side with the 149th behind the same wall. Was it not a remarkable coincidence that we met for the first time? We drove the Rebs away from the stone wall by which they lay by the heavy fire behind our breastworks. The Rebs were repulsed at every point, and on our left their loss is very heavy. We have taken a larger number of prisoners than they." And all is quiet this morning. I think, you know, talking to his letdown, right? The day before is, we've got this, we won, and then they wake up and there's collection duty and the horribleness of the aftermath of war. As the weather turned cold, the 122nd was no closer to Richmond than it had been the year before. Osgood had time to reflect on the U.S. colored troops, which were just added to the Union cause. Osgood's abolitionist beliefs, which came from his family and the Sedgwicks, who he spent a lot of time with, and so many of their friends there in the Sedgwick Farm, James Street area, the Barnes, the Wilkinsons. Sedgwick was the lawyer for Gerrit Smith, who was a national abolitionist. These grew stronger as the war continued. The Reverend Samuel Joseph May from Syracuse, but originally from Boston, continued to send abolitionist material to Osgood in the mail. In the winter of 1864, the regiment received news that they would be serving as guards on Johnson's Island off Sandusky, Ohio. It was a 300-acre island, and over a 40-month period, 10,000 prisoners were processed. The maximum held at one time was 3,224. There was the looming presidential election and the emergence of Copperhead movement again in the New York City draft riots during the new year. So lots going on, still so much. The war is not near over. This was the prison. Osgood wrote, "The rebel prisoners were well fed, clean, comfortably housed, and well treated, in great contrast to the condition and treatment of our poor fellows confined in southern prisons." His landlord there, he was housed in the town, whereas the officers were able to choose their housing in town, which was super fun for them. They met people, and what a break from the war. So the privates were on the island with the prisoners, and they would go back and forth. They crossed Lake Erie, by the way, in the winter, in the freezing, like, windstorm going over. He wrote about that and the fun they had on the train getting there. She wrote, "The Sanduskians had contracted a life interest in a 3 months acquaintance brought so unexpectedly to our doors in obedience to the orders of Uncle Sam, whose stay with us has opened new avenues to our thoughts and affections." She wrote of Osgood, "You must know that the impression you have left here is that of an exceedingly courteous and agreeable young gentleman." In the spring of 1864, returning from Sandusky, the regiment marched forward in a campaign that would ultimately take it 1 year. and lead to the Confederacy's destruction. Osgood explained, "We returned to the Army to find them preparing for Grant's Richmond campaign. But our long line of 1,000 men had dwindled. We left home less than 2 years before. They had dwindled away. We probably had less than 400 men fit for duty when we started on that bloody campaign. The road to Richmond was 70 miles long, blocked by the Army of Northern Virginia. What remained of the 122nd was cast into the fray, engaged with the enemy more often than at any period before in their service." On May 5th, during the Battle of the Wilderness, Osgood had been recently promoted. He and a number of men and their general were surrounded at gunpoint by 20 Confederates, and they were told to surrender. The Confederates came out from around the trees. There were many of these instances. Thousands of our Union men were captured. The privates were sent to Libby Prison in Richmond, known for abuse and starvation. Officers were sent to the Warwick House Prison, which is where Osgood was sent along with the team he was with there in Lynchburg. They were there 10 days, and he and another lieutenant, Mortimer Birdseye of the 142nd, started planning an escape, which included buying Confederate jackets and falling in with a procession of guards from inside the prison out. This is the escape route. They did make it out, and they trekked by foot, disguised as rebels, 200 miles. And Osgood wrote such interesting stories about every place they went, the plantations, the people they met. Some of the Southerners knew that they were Unioners. You know, they try to make them talk like they were Southerners. And there were all these fun stories and scary stories. They nearly were shot numerous times. His brother Will had quite an interesting history in the war. He had one of the most varied services of any soldier, North or South, in the way that he was all over the theaters. In 1862, after 1 year of service in the East, he resigned from his officer position. He felt he was given it because of family connections. He took a train west and he wrote his mother from Louisville, Kentucky. He wrote, "It is not," and the letter is within the scrapbooks, "It's not right to take an appointment away from some man who will make as good an officer as I would, and who is entitled to it by services faithfully performed in the company. So if any of my friends are trying to get me an appointment, you must tell them to stop, for I will not accept a commission until I have fairly earned one in my own judgment. I am determined to stay in the service as long as the war lasts, and will not be contented at home as long as there are any soldiers left in the field." He was not going to be the brother that stayed home with the mother. He was on the field for sure. He was wounded at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He was back in the West back in the East after proving himself in the West. He was an aide to camp, as they called it, to General Henry Slocum, sort of the general's right-hand man, almost like a spy. He was given an order to deliver a message to General Williams. The order would change the course this general took in battle. And after fulfilling his mission, it was dark out. Will was riding and he discovered himself in enemy territory. The moon came out from behind clouds and he was more lit up, and the Confederate General, A.P. Hill, who was only second to General Lee, ordered to shoot him, kill him. Will decided not to surrender and rather ride for his life. He was shot at from multiple directions and hit in his arm, but he made it back to Union lines alive. A Union surgeon the next day removed 4 inches of Will's arm bone rather than amputating it. Here was Will post-war The 4-inch section of bone was housed in the Smithsonian Institute until at least the 1980s as an exhibit of Revolutionary Civil War surgery. The end of war in sight, January through May 1865. In the winter, the regiment settled into the trenches around Petersburg. Osgood was writing Nellie more frequently, and she was writing back. You can tell in his letters there's sort of a sense of relief and renewed faith in their relationship from Osgood's perspective. The assassination of President Lincoln so close to the end of the war must have been completely devastating to the North. The day following, Charles Sedgwick spoke a eulogy that he wrote to thousands in downtown Syracuse. Osgood and the regiment were mustered out on June 23rd, 1865. They headed home. And I'll just read here. A lot of the men, they waited for this war to end, and yet they were nervous to go home. They didn't know what they would be doing. They left their jobs years before, and how could they go home and feel the same way they did before? They'd lost their friends, and they had to figure out how to go home. Of course, there was excitement, but there was trepidation for sure. Osgood's good friend that wrote him often, many of the letters are within this book, wrote him in the spring, "You must go home now and comfort your mother, who has spared you so long, only because your country needed you. You have enough already of hairbreadth escapes to entertain your children and grandchildren with, as long as you have a voice to tell them." Osgood took up a job with C.C. Loomis and Company, which was a coffee company. Coffee was something that comes up in his letters a lot. His mother loved coffee, and I believe that the interest came from the China trade back when her sister's husband was sailing. He sailed the China trade ship twice around the world, bringing back coffees and teas and everything. And so that interest went through the generations, and Osgood's friends would often talk about, "I pant for your mother's coffee." And so he took a passion and went with that for his work. He eventually founded O.V. Tracy Coffee Company, and he and Nellie were married in 1867, 2 years after the war. A reception was held at the Sedgwick home. They had 4 sons, a daughter, Sarah, this name keeps continuing, Sally, who sadly died of diphtheria at age 4. But Osgood wrote his mother, May 11th, "I don't believe there will be any desire to attempt another rebellion until the memory of this shall have perished, which will at least ensure peace to my great-grandchildren." This was Nellie with a locket with her daughter. I recently my mother's cousin found this lovely photo of Sally. She's beautiful. This was O.V. Tracy and Company, downtown Syracuse. This was one of the tin cans from the company, and the Tracy family, the generations continued to run this business until about 1950. And my mother and her cousins filled the coffee tins on weekends or after school. They all helped. Post-war, Osgood and his brother gave many speeches. Osgood tended to speak to young audience or would be interviewed in news articles. He also met with Southern generals. There was all this talk about Reconstruction and how people were getting along. I know that in those news articles, you can just hear Osgood biting his tongue at certain things. But this is actually this speech to those of us who participated. The events of the war were so real that we forget the years that have passed. And that was it being published. Both brothers, spoke, like I said, and Brother Will spoke of the need to help veterans and their families. This was his new mission, and he demanded monuments to be established. He said that New York State was not following the state of Massachusetts that were putting up monuments to their servicemen. They felt forgotten, and he was frustrated with that. And he spoke about it, and together they raised funds for a monument to be installed at Gettysburg. And on the 25th anniversary, back at Culp's Hill, where they fought, this monument was placed, and there Osgood read his speech, which is right here. I'm sharing these special documents today. Comrades of the 122nd of Shaler's Brigade. Will Tracy, I add some of his speech here just because he is a magnificent writer, very patriotic and romantic. He said at the 24th anniversary right here at Syracuse and Long Branch Park, "We shall never cease to feel a thrill of pride so long as we continue to breathe, that in the morning of our lives, when everything was at its brightest and its best, when the dew was on the flower and the night was on the wave, when life was still, the rose's hope while yet unknown, we were willing to sacrifice it all. That we were willing to give up the full pleasures of this world, which we had just begun to experience as men, to destroy, to throw down our work, to destroy our careers we had marked out for ourselves. Our lives were as sweet, our happiness as dear to us as life and happiness are now to the men who walk our streets today. Yet we were willing to surrender all without hesitation. For our foes in the North, whom we left behind us and who continually endeavored to obstruct the progress of the war, we can only feel disgust and contempt. And it is a satisfaction to think that the name of Copperhead will remain a brand of disgrace to them through successive generations. Copperhead was a term used for those in the North that were not for abolition of slavery. They were all for keeping the slaves enslaved, the men and women and children enslaved. The members of this regiment have experienced all the different casualties and vicissitudes incident to active service. The remains of some lie buried in the wilderness of Virginia. Others sleep their last sleep about Cold Harbor and Petersburg, and some be near home and at the soil of our sister state, Pennsylvania. Some were wounded and captured, and in addition to the horrors of rebel imprisonment, sustained the pain and suffering of wounds improperly cared for. Here's Osgood at a reunion and the regiment. This is at Long Branch Park. This was their regiment flag that at the rally that was given, and it has the different battles: Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Wilderness, and you can see how tattered it became. I talked about how there was the talk of the Reconstruction and how things were going between the North and the South, and Osgood and Nellie and Mortimer Birdseye, who he escaped with, and his wife traveled south, and Osgood wanted, it wasn't long before he passed, actually, probably 5 years, and he went down, he wanted to see that prison again, and without a ton of communication like we have today, he arrived, and unfortunately it was taken down, and there's a news article about it. But they retraced their 200 miles that the two officers trekked way back when. And Osgood and Nellie's son, James Grant Tracy, married a Southern gal. She was from Rome, Georgia. They met at Cornell University. They were married in 1901. And this is my great-grandmother, who I spoke of. In the beginning, she was a historian and writer like myself. I have all of her notes. She tried getting published. It's amazing. I love coming across her little notes and papers. Her father, interestingly, served in the Confederacy. He was a mayor of Rome, but after he had served in the Confederacy along with my great-grandmother's two brothers. And this was their wedding party. The family, Osgood is there. This is Flo, my great-grandmother's father, who fought in the Confederacy. And my great-grandmother had said, people would ask, well, what was the atmosphere there? And she said, cool but cordial. So here it was, 1901, and the North and South are friends, but maybe not best friends. After the war, I'll just summarize Aaron. The oldest, Tracy brother, he had become a well-known civil engineer and surveyor, particularly in legal cases. He was an organizer of the Syracuse Savings Bank and a trustee. He worked on railroads, and he spent a lot of time in the South. He never married. That's interesting.
The screen tends to pop up sometimes.
Yeah. Let's see, and then Will, who had fought in the war, the older photograph of him, he became a lawyer in Syracuse. He practiced here and was a member of the Century Club and various organizations. He was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor. His general wrote and put in for that years later, and his story is included in the Deeds of Valor book, which you can find. Later in life, very late in life, he wed Marion Gott. This is an escutcheon, and it details his service, which was very varied. And the Medal of Honor is painted. These were given to soldiers after the war by their families. It's a beautiful, it's painted, and it details out their history. Osgood's mother lived to be age 97. She was certainly so important to the three remaining Tracy brothers. She sounds like quite a spitfire, actually, in some of her letters. She was tough. She was the mother and the father. She was fond of flowers, outdoor activity, and she was an excellent horsewoman. She drove her two favorite pair of horses 2 weeks before she died. Her obituary states that she was an abolitionist, and she enjoyed conversation with young people. As she lost her friends, everyone enjoyed talking with her too. This is a painting that is in our family of Osgood and Nellie in their elder years. Osgood lived to be 68. He passed in 1909, and Nellie in 1924 at the age of 83. And I will just end this by reading a quote. In 1904, George Walters, a veteran of the 148th Pennsylvania, eloquently pled for the importance of preserving the memory of the Civil War for future generations. He wrote, "We may not be able to leave our children gold, jewels, precious stones, or wealth, but there is something money cannot buy: honor. That is transmitted as an heirloom for which generations yet unborn will bless us and hold our memory in sacred reverence. While over the fireplace the old sword will be suspended, and many an evening while willed away in recounting the heroic deeds that reflect honor out of the dim ages of long ago." Quote, "My father went down in the great battle of Gettysburg. My father stood on the brink of starvation in Andersonville prison. My father helped to carry the flag above the clouds of Lookout Mountain. My father stood beneath the leaden hail at Vicksburg. My father marched with Meade through wilderness, Spotsylvania, and heard the shouts of victory at the surrender of Appomattox in April 1865. These are the priceless relics transmitted to posterity that no thief in the night can steal. This is the grand heritage brought with the blood and suffering of our fathers, which no engraver can counterfeit." Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Oh, Sarah. Thank you.
I've stopped sharing the slides, so we're
I'm
focused on, you're not off yet, but if anybody had any questions.
Oh, yes.
Does anybody have any questions? And I will ask online as well.
Yes. I think I went over so much, there may not be questions. Thank you for listening for an hour. Yes.
That battle that you mentioned
Mhm.
that had more casualties than any other, why don't more people know about that? I had never heard about that one.
Well, Civil War historians and, you know, people who study it know about it. And that's a really good question. I've wondered that myself. You know, I think that, you know, it was a one-day battle. So, you know, you often hear of Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, and all these longer battles. But it is known in the Civil War circles for sure.
Antietam?
Antietam, yeah. Yeah, so,
There were actually 2 battles of Antietam,
well, that
a
was
year apart. I
a
think.
year apart. Yes, they did come back. Yes, they did come back there.
Was it the first one or the second one?
This was a first one.
Okay.
Yes, I believe. I shouldn't say so for sure. You know, again, all that like the Civil War details. That's where my collaborator Ryan Keating, if he were here, he could answer some of those questions. And I know that that is true that Antietam, they did come back there again, but that was the one that's most talked about for sure. You know, Osgood wrote about, that was really, they had just arrived, right? And they, the next day were, you know, seeing dead people for the first time, you know, that were killed in war anyway, and in heaps and along the road, and, you know, how difficult for these young men who had just left home and they were young. You know, it was so terrible that there's a riverbank that runs where they walked on this road. It's called Bloody Lane because there was so much death that the river turned red. So it's tough. Tough way to start off for sure. And so, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you
for being
having
here.
me here at the Manlius Public Library, which I should have thanked in the very beginning.